The last thing my grandmother ever squeezed into my hand wasn't money, jewelry, or a key. It was my hand. Her fingers were thin and trembling, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She looked into my eyes with a tired smile and whispered, "A home isn't made of wood and bricks, Lily. It's made of the people who refuse to abandon it." At the time, I thought she was talking about loneliness. I had no idea she was warning me. For nearly 5 years, Grandma Eleanor's white farmhouse had been my second home. Every morning before work, I stopped by to make breakfast, refill her medications, and water the roses she loved more than anything. After work, I'd return to cook dinner, help her organize old photographs, and sit beside her on the porch while she told stories about Grandpa. The rest of my family rarely visited. My parents always claimed they were too busy. My older brother, Nathan, said the drive was too long. My aunt insisted hospitals made her uncomfortable, yet somehow, every holiday they managed to appear just long enough to take pictures and remind everyone how much they loved Grandma. She never complained. She simply smiled after they left and asked if I wanted another slice of her home-made apple pie. When she passed away peacefully one rainy Tuesday morning, I felt like the world had stopped breathing. The funeral was beautiful. Everyone cried. Everyone called her the heart of the family. Everyone spoke about how much they would miss her. Listening to their speeches, you'd think they had been by her bedside every day instead of visiting only when it was convenient. I stayed quiet. Grief had exhausted me too much to argue. A week later, my parents invited everyone to their house for what they called a family discussion. I assumed we would talk about preserving Grandma's farmhouse. It wasn't just a house. It was where every birthday had been celebrated, every Christmas dinner shared, and every childhood memory created. The walls still carried pencil marks showing our heights as children. Grandpa's workshop remained untouched. Grandma's recipe cards still rested in the kitchen drawer exactly where she'd left them. I walked into the meeting believing we were going to protect those memories. Instead, I walked into a decision that had already been made. Dad cleared his throat. "We've agreed to sell the property." The words hit me harder than the funeral had. I blinked. "We've agreed." Nathan wouldn't even look at me. Mom folded her arms. "The house is too expensive to maintain." But Grandma loved that house. Grandma's gone. My aunt replied flatly, "It's just a building now. Just a building." Those 3 words felt like someone tearing pages from my childhood. I looked around the room. No one disagreed. No one hesitated. The contracts had already been prepared. The realtor had already been hired. Even the buyer had already been chosen. My name had never entered the conversation. "You made all of this without telling me," I asked quietly. Dad sighed as though I were being unreasonable. "You were too emotionally attached." I stared at him in disbelief. I was the one taking care of her. "And we're grateful," Mom said with a polite smile that felt colder than winter. "But this is a financial decision." A financial decision. 5 years of caregiving had been reduced to a line of polite gratitude. The meeting ended within 20 minutes. No vote, no discussion, no chance to speak. I drove to Grandma's farmhouse one last time before the sale became official. A bright red sold sign stood proudly in the front yard. The porch swing where we'd spent hundreds of evenings creaked gently in the wind. The roses I had watered only days earlier were beginning to bloom. I stood there with tears filling my eyes, feeling as though my family hadn't just sold Grandma's home. They had erased me from it. As I reached into my pocket, my fingers found the small silver thimble Grandma had always carried for sewing. It was the only keepsake she had personally given me. I closed my hand around it and remembered her final words. "A home belongs to the one who protects it, not the one who profits from it." For the first time since her funeral, I stopped crying. Instead, I made myself a quiet promise. If my family believed this was the end of Grandma's story, They were about to discover it was only the beginning. For weeks after the sale, I avoided driving down Maple Road. Every turn toward Grandma Aliner's farmhouse felt like reopening a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. I told myself there was no reason to look anymore. The house belonged to someone else now. My family had made sure of that. Still, every night, memories found me. I could almost smell Grandma's cinnamon bread baking in the old oven. I could hear the grandfather clock chiming every hour and the gentle creak of the porch swing where we watched countless sunsets together. Those memories refused to disappear, no matter how much my relatives insisted the house had been just another property. 3 months passed. Life became routine again, or at least it looked that way from the outside. I buried myself in work, accepting every extra project my company offered. I worked late evenings, weekends, even holidays. My coworkers assumed I was chasing a promotion. The truth was much simpler. I was chasing a dream. Grandma used to tell me, money isn't meant to impress people. It's meant to give you choices when life gets difficult. For years, I'd followed her advice. I lived modestly, skipped expensive vacations, drove the same reliable car, and quietly invested every extra dollar I earned. At the time, I never imagined those savings would one day become my greatest weapon, not for revenge, but for redemption. One rainy afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of me. I searched the county property records online. The farmhouse hadn't been purchased by a family eager to live there. It had been bought by a real estate investment company. My heart sank. To them, Grandma's home wasn't filled with memories. It was a line on a spreadsheet. A few days later, I drove past the property for the first time since the sale. The curtains were gone. The flower beds were neglected. Grandma's roses, once vibrant with reds and pinks, were beginning to wither. The porch light she'd insisted on leaving on every evening had been removed entirely. It looked lonely. I sat in my car across the street for nearly an hour before making a decision. I wasn't ready to let go. Instead of confronting my family, I started researching the investment company. I learned they specialized in buying older homes, holding them for several months, and reselling them to developers for a profit. That meant one thing: the farmhouse wasn't their forever investment. It was temporary. For the first time since Grandma's funeral, hope quietly returned. Over the next 6 months, I became more disciplined than ever. Every paycheck went into my savings account. I sold a few investments that had grown significantly in value, and even took on freelance work during the evenings. It wasn't glamorous, but every dollar brought me one step closer to something that seemed impossible. Then, one crisp autumn morning, I received the news I'd been waiting for. The investment company had listed Grandma's farmhouse for sale. My hands trembled as I stared at the listing. The asking price was higher than what my family had accepted, but it was still within reach. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not Nathan, not a single cousin or aunt. I contacted the listing agent using only my legal name, which was different from the nickname everyone in my family used. I wanted no connection that might raise suspicion. Negotiations lasted nearly 3 weeks. Every phone call felt like a lifetime. Finally, on a quiet Friday afternoon, the agent called. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "Your offer has been accepted." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Tears blurred my vision as I looked out the office window. I wasn't crying because I had bought a house. I was crying because I had brought Grandma's home back where it belonged. Closing day arrived 2 weeks later. I signed every document with shaking hands. When the final paper was complete, the attorney slid a folder across the table. "Welcome home." Those 2 words meant more than anyone in that room could possibly understand. I drove straight to the farmhouse. The front door opened with a soft creak, just as it always had. Dust covered the furniture, and the rooms felt empty, but the soul of the house was still there, waiting patiently. I walked into the kitchen and rested my hand on the old wooden counter where Grandma used to roll pie dough. I kept my promise, I whispered. Outside, the roses still struggled to bloom despite months of neglect. I picked up a watering can from the shed and slowly began watering every flower bed, just as Grandma had taught me years ago. No one in my family knew what had happened. They still believed Grandma's house was gone forever. They had no idea that the person they had pushed aside now held the deed in their hands. And I intended to keep that secret until the perfect moment. Owning Grandma Eliner's farmhouse again felt like getting a second chance at a life I thought I'd lost. For the first few weeks, I told no one. Every evening after work, I drove to the house with a toolbox in one hand and a notebook in the other. There was so much to repair. The porch steps had begun to sag, the roof leaked during heavy rain, and the once bright white paint had faded into a dull gray. The roses Grandma loved had nearly died from neglect, but unlike the investment company, I didn't see repairs. I saw memories waiting to breathe again. I spent every spare dollar restoring the house exactly the way Grandma had left it. I sanded the old oak floors by hand instead of replacing them because I could still remember Grandpa teaching me how to skate across them in socks. I carefully polished Grandma's antique kitchen table until its warm glow returned. Her collection of blue ceramic bowls went back onto the shelves exactly where she used to keep them. The hardest room to restore was her bedroom. Her favorite quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. Her reading glasses rested on the nightstand, and beside the novel she'd never finished. For a long time, I simply stood in the doorway, unable to step inside. It felt wrong, as though she had only gone outside to water the garden and would return at any moment. "I'm home, Grandma," I whispered. The silence somehow felt comforting instead of empty. Months passed. Spring arrived, and the farmhouse slowly came back to life. The roses bloomed brighter than they had in years. Children from the neighborhood stopped to admire the flower garden. Neighbors who had known Grandma for decades smiled whenever they saw lights glowing through the windows again. Many of them recognized me immediately. "It's exactly how your grandmother would have wanted it, Mrs. Collins, the elderly woman next door, told me one afternoon. Those words meant more than any compliment I'd ever received. Meanwhile, my family rarely mentioned the farmhouse anymore. The money from the sale had disappeared faster than anyone expected. Nathan bought an expensive luxury SUV that quickly became too costly to maintain. My parents remodeled their kitchen and booked several lavish vacations. My aunt invested in a business that failed within months. The inheritance they had rushed to collect slowly slipped through their fingers. Grandma's home, however, only grew more valuable with every passing season. Almost a year after I bought it back, the town announced its annual Heritage Garden Tour. Several historic homes would open their gardens to visitors, and my restored farmhouse was selected as one of the featured properties. The event attracted hundreds of people. Local newspapers published photographs of the beautifully restored house. One headline caught everyone's attention: "Historic farmhouse beautifully restored by new owner." I knew it wouldn't take long. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Nathan. I heard something strange," he said awkwardly. "What did you hear?" "They're saying Grandma's old house wasn't demolished." It wasn't. A long silence followed. "Someone restored it. I know. You've seen it. I live there." The silence that followed lasted so long I wondered if the call had disconnected. Finally, he laughed nervously. "Stop joking. I'm not. What do you mean? You live there. I mean exactly what I said." Before he could ask another question, I calmly ended the call. The following Saturday afternoon, 3 cars pulled into my driveway: my parents, Nathan, my aunt, 2 cousins. Every single person who had agreed to sell the house stood frozen outside the front gate. Their mouths literally fell open. The farmhouse looked almost identical to the way it had during Grandma's happiest years. Fresh white paint covered the walls. The wraparound porch gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Hanging flower baskets overflowed with bright colors, and Grandma's roses framed the front walkway in full bloom. I stepped onto the porch carrying a watering can, exactly as Grandma used to do. Mom stared at me in disbelief. "Lily," I smiled politely. "Hello." Dad looked around the property before finally asking the question everyone else was too stunned to say. "Who owns this place now?" "I do." Nathan shook his head. "That's impossible." I reached into my pocket and removed a small key ring. Attached to it was Grandma's old brass house key. It became possible the day all of you decided memories were worth less than money. No one spoke. Their eyes wandered across the porch, the flower garden, and the restored windows. Everything they had been so eager to sell was standing before them, more beautiful than ever. Mom quietly asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at each of them before answering. "Because when you sold this house, you made it clear that my opinion didn't matter. I simply returned the favor." For the first time in their lives, they had nothing to say. And as they stood there in stunned silence, I realized something unexpected. Buying the house back hadn't been my revenge. Watching them understand what they had truly lost, that was. The afternoon my family stood speechless on Grandma Elinor's front porch, I expected to feel victorious. For months I had imagined that moment. I had pictured the shock on their faces, the regret in their eyes, and the awkward silence that would follow when they realized the house they had thrown away was mine again. And all of it happened exactly as I had imagined, yet something surprised me. I didn't feel anger, I felt peace. Grandma had always said, "Revenge that leaves you bitter isn't revenge at all. The best answer to cruelty is building a life so full of love that no one can take it from you." Standing on the porch she loved, I finally understood what she meant. Dad was the first to break the silence. "Lily, we made a mistake. It was the first time anyone in my family had admitted that, not once during the sale, not during the funeral, not after cutting me out of every decision. Only now when they saw what the farmhouse had become." Mom wiped tears from her eyes. "We thought selling it was the practical thing to do. You didn't just sell a house," I replied calmly. "You sold the place where Grandma spent 60 years loving this family, and when you did that, you made sure I had no voice in the decision." No one argued. Because they couldn't. Every word was true. Nathan slowly walked through the garden, stopping beside Grandma's favorite rose bushes. "I remember planting these with Grandpa," he whispered. I nodded. "So do I." The difference was that I had never forgotten. After a long silence, my aunt quietly asked the question everyone had been thinking. "Would you sell it back to the family?" I smiled gently. "No." Her shoulders dropped. "But you're welcome to visit." Confusion spread across their faces. "Visit," Mom repeated. "This house isn't an investment anymore," I said. "It's a promise." Over the following months, I began turning that promise into something bigger than I had ever imagined. With part of my savings, I restored Grandpa's old workshop and transformed it into a free community woodworking studio where retired craftsmen could teach young people traditional skills. Grandma's large dining room became the heart of the house again. Once a month, I hosted free community dinners for elderly neighbors who often spent holidays alone. The laughter that filled the room sounded remarkably like the family gatherings Grandma used to host. Her garden became a place where local children learned how to grow vegetables and flowers. Most importantly, I created the Elinor Grant Memorial Scholarship, a yearly award for students who dedicated their time to caring for elderly family members. Grandma had always believed kindness deserved recognition. Now it finally had it. News of the project spread throughout the town. People who had never met Grandma began learning her story. They didn't remember her because she had owned a beautiful farmhouse. They remembered her because she had changed lives through simple acts of love. Ironically, the same newspaper that once announced the sale of her home now published a feature titled, "Granddaughter Preserves Family Legacy Through Community Home." My relatives read every word. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 2 years after Grandma's passing, they asked if they could attend one of the community dinners. I agreed, not because they deserved it, because Grandma would have wanted the door to remain open. They arrived quietly, carrying homemade dishes instead of expensive gifts. Dad volunteered to repair an old fence. Nathan spent the afternoon helping children build birdhouses in Grandpa's workshop. Mom planted fresh roses beside the front porch. No one mentioned money, no one talked about inheritance. For the first time in years, we simply worked together. As the sun began to set, everyone gathered on the porch with slices of warm apple pie baked from Grandma's original recipe. The same recipe card still rested in her familiar handwriting. Dad looked across the yard where children laughed among the flowers. "I thought we inherited money," he said softly, "but this." He looked around the farmhouse. This was the real inheritance. I smiled. It always was. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch swing. The summer breeze carried the scent of blooming roses through the garden. I reached into my pocket and held Grandma's silver thimble, the little keepsake she had placed in my hand during our final goodbye. For years, I thought my family had taken everything from me. I had been wrong. They had only given me the opportunity to protect what truly mattered. The farmhouse still stood exactly where it always had, not as a monument to wealth, but as a reminder that love cannot be measured in dollars. My family lost their share of the house the day they chose greed over gratitude. I gained something far greater the day I chose compassion over revenge. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge wasn't watching them regret their choices. It was proving that Grandma's greatest legacy had never been hidden inside the walls of her home. It had been living quietly inside the heart of the one person who never stopped believing that some things are simply not for sale. The end.